Hi, and welcome to Podcasting 101 with Rachel. This podcast is for busy female entrepreneurs who run their own businesses and want to start a podcast, or who may already have a podcast. I want to share practical information and tips on how you can get your podcast started and managing it along the way. I'll also be interviewing other female podcast hosts to give you real insight into what it's like having your own podcast. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode. Today I have Sarah Giffrow, and she is coming to talk about some of the pitfalls or do's and don'ts about podcasting. And so to start with, Sarah, do you want to just introduce yourself and let us know who you are and what you do?
So my name's Sarah Giffrow, and I am the owner and creative director, benevolent overlord, I like to say, of Upswitch Creative.
I love that on your email.
And we do website, social media, and email marketing for established, ethical, and passionate small businesses and nonprofits. So that's our main gig.
Awesome. And so we're here to talk about a podcast that isn't live anymore. It was one that you did a couple of years ago now?
Yeah. It was a couple of years ago. And this was a side project. It was totally unrelated to my business, which maybe is kind of rare. But yeah, I started it in March of 2020. It was called Mixed Metaphors, and it was centered around interviews with mixed race folks, of which I am one. And so, and just the journey of figuring out our identities and how we take up space and various different spaces, whether they're like white spaces or, person of color spaces, or, everything in between, and just a lot of the stories around that. So, and I got a lot of good feedback from the folks I talked to. They were like, "I'm so glad you're doing this," but I definitely made some choices that made it more difficult than it needed to be, which is why I'm no longer doing it.
So let's start with, it was a passion project. What made you want to start it? Obviously, March 2020 was it pre-COVID or just as it hit? It was the idea percolating for a while pre kind of COVID, or?
Yeah, it was something I had in mind for probably 6 months or so prior to COVID, and I think I'd done a couple of interviews at that point, but I was very much taking my time with it, and then COVID started, and I was like, well, I have all of this free time at home. I can figure out this podcast thing. It seemed like a nice idea at the time, but yeah, I think that it was a mistake in the long run, because as the pandemic went on, I think my capacity, I think a lot of people's capacity to just do anything dropped precipitously.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's a big thing to consider when you are thinking about starting a project of this sort, is just, whether it's a pandemic or a major life event, or even just like a lot of small stuff that's draining your energy. You have to really be real with yourself about your capacity, and ask yourself, what are you going to have to put aside in order to make room for this? Because it's going to take time, and that time has to come from somewhere. So, and that energy as well.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. I think that's kind of like one of the first questions that I would say to somebody if they were thinking about starting a podcast, like say this kind of size of a project. Be realistic with the amount of time that you have to just to spend on it, and whether it then at that point, maybe depending on whether you have the funds spending, whether it's a passion project or for your business, whether you could outsource some of those parts, or whether that's even an option for you. or making it in a way that, okay, I can't commit to weekly episodes, so let's start with monthly episodes, or just having that knowledge so you can base it, if you really want to do it, into your working life. But it is a big commitment, whether you've got somebody helping you or not. You still got to come up with those creative ideas around what you would like your episodes to be, and the planning, and the fact that it just takes time, recording and editing and all those other things that make, and then promoting it, that make it happen. So what was the first kind of thing that you came across that maybe that you stumbled over, or that you started to feel that maybe it was a bigger project than you thought? Or
Well, the funny thing is, as far as the promotional side, I think that's where a lot of people would get hung up. But given that, I already had website skills and social media experience, I felt like I know how to set up the website and the podcast feed. I already have a host. I know how to promote things online, and so that piece I kind of had in the bag, but I think a lot of other folks wouldn't necessarily. But I think a lot of my issues stemmed from the desire to nitpick at myself, which I think we're all a little guilty of that sometimes. So yeah, I would say don't spend a lot of time editing yourself. I feel like you need to kind of brace yourself for the sound of your own voice sometimes.
I was talking. I did a post today about perfectionism, actually, because it was making me think that, like, you're talking about, the sound of your own voice can be hard to hear. I still don't always like the sound of my voice, or how often I might say or so, and when you listen to yourself quite a lot, you kind of see those things and you pick those things out. So you have to kind of try and put those things aside sometimes, because if you let it get in your own head, it's very difficult when you're editing and you're listening to it over and over again. It kind of just becomes, oh no, I don't really feel comfortable with that. So that's something that, I mean, yeah, everyone with imposter syndrome as well, I think, is a big, all those types of feelings. Was that were you finding that hard? Like, was that getting in your head when you were interviewing people as well, do you think, or just kind of like at the editing stage?
Yeah, I think less so during the interviews themselves. I definitely thought about it, but yeah, it was definitely in the editing stage where, any sort of like, vocal fry or saying or like or any of that, it's going to be 100 times more grating when it's in your own voice. Like, your voice doesn't sound the same as in your head as it does on a recording, and it's so jarring. It's like you kind of dissociate from it. Almost like, that's not me. I don't sound like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely felt that. I know one tip that someone says is re-listening to it over and over. Like, by listening to it over and over again, you kind of get used to the sound of your own voice, is one way. There's a guy that, Tom Stanhope, he was talking about video as well, about how we're uncomfortable in a video about seeing ourselves. But it's because we don't often see ourselves from that angle. Only when we look in a mirror, we don't really think about it. So when you're like presented with this image of yourself, it's kind of the same as your voice. And he kind of recommends like listening to yourself to get used to the sound of your own voice.
I definitely agree with that about video too. There have been a few instances where edited video of myself, and yeah, you're not usually talking to yourself when you look in the mirror. So like, no. When you're watching a video, it's like, what is my face doing right now? It's really out there.
Yeah. I get so distracted by my own face sometimes. Just like stick a post-it note over my own face. It's like, no, I don't want to look like that. Why is that? But yeah, there are things that you do need to like get over that to get to the next hurdle. So how did you find it from, I mean, you being a website designer, you're pretty tech savvy, so did you find the process of editing fairly easy?
That's the thing, is I don't think it was, and a lot of it was just obsessing about those details. And yeah, there's a bit of learning curve with the different editing tools that, I didn't ever feel like I really got the hang of it. So yeah, it's definitely it was definitely a learning experience in that regard.
What did you use for editing? Out of interest.
Yeah, how was it called? Oh yeah, I used Audacity. They call it.
Oh yes, yeah, yes. I use Audacity. That's what I use. I really like Audacity.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is also, I think it's kind of a pitfall of my experience too, is that, well, my husband has a podcast called the Weird History Podcast.
Okay.
So we already had good equipment in the house, but then I was also like, he uses Audacity, I should use Audacity. He hosts his feed on Blueberry, I should host it on Blueberry. And I don't know if those are necessarily the right tools for me. And I think I wish I would have thought harder about that and maybe done a bit more experimenting, just because I know from like the website worlds that, there are like different site editors and different tools, and what's intuitive to one person is not going to be intuitive to another. So I could have tried harder in researching editing software to make sure I was using something that really worked for me.
There's a lot of information out there about different podcast host platforms and editing tools. So I know a lot of Mac users. I'm not a Mac user myself. I don't use Apple. I'm Android, but GarageBand apparently is really good for editing. A lot of people I know use that. I use Audacity, but I have used that in the past years and years ago in my degree, so I kind of had some familiarity with it. So, but there are some, I think, even with Anchor now. So Anchor's the free platform that's like linked with Spotify, and I think there's like Alitu as well, and you can edit in there. And I find those a little bit clunky to edit depending on what type of editing you want to do. But to make it simple, if you want to kind of put conversations on there that you don't want to take too much out, bar maybe if there's like, some interruption in the middle, you can clip the ends. And some of them even have like a sound processing thing where they'll do like a general thing for you to make that easier for you, which I think is great if you can have that all in one place. And often that's a big barrier for people to starting. And like so you face with this decision of not sure what to do without. I mean, I spent a lot of the time researching. I mean, mainly as well being a podcast manager, I wanted to see what was out there and what potentially I could suggest to different clients and stuff. And then you start diving into all of that and you think, oh my gosh, like so I'd not heard of Blueberry when you mentioned that. So there are so many different ones out there with different functionalities. I'm not surprised you went with the one that your husband had, because it's just like, well, it works for him, and so I guess that's one kind of thing, is making sure the tech works for you and exploring a couple of different options before you settle on one, and getting some advice off a few different people. So what other things did you find, that any of the problems that you kind of came across?
I think I had a fair amount of overthinking at play as well. So I definitely overthought the format, and it's really going to be better to keep it simple at the outset. So because my podcast was centered around interviews with mixed race folks, I mean, I totally could have just recorded our conversation and posted it to the feed and voila, it's out there. But I don't know, I was probably listening to too much 99% Invisible or This American Life or whatever. And I just came in with this like really grandiose vision of storytelling, and I'd be like narrating like Roman Mars and it just...
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it just added so much complexity that I didn't anticipate. So, that turned into like hours and hours of tedious editing and like splicing clips together, and I absolutely hated it. And it's probably the major reason I let go of the project is that, yeah, I was expecting way too much out of myself right out of the gates. Like, a lot of those really well-known podcasts, they have entire teams behind them. They have people doing their research. They got the sound engineers and editors, and it's their entire job to do that one piece. And so expecting
all that wearing, all the hats, doing everything. Yeah, they got a massive production team, producers, everything, everybody there. So what was the format then? So you had the conversations with the different folks that you had on, and then what bits were you narrating over? I'm just interested to see how you kind of came up with that type of format.
Yeah, I had questions that I would ask them, and I would sort of look for the story in there. I mean, I was really focused on creating a space where they could just talk about what spoke to them, and I just held space for them and listened. And so it wasn't so much like a back and forth of us having a conversation necessarily. I was more just like listening to and looking for the story, and so I would put the pieces together in a way that made sense, and then give a little bit of context.
So the episode would be more of them with the story, telling their story, not like a question kind of answer kind of thing, and then have you doing the little parts in there.
Yeah,
that's really, you should I know you said it might not be available anymore before we hit record, but it would be really interesting to listen to the podcast as well. Just to see that type. That's not something that I guess the type of podcast that I've created is not the same as the type of what the idea, the concept of the idea that you wanted to do. If you could redo it again, what things, how would you like to see the format now to make it to still get across what you want to get across in your podcast, but make it easier for yourself so that you would continue to get that content out there?
Yeah, I think I would definitely start with just having a more organic format to my interviews. And interviewing people is a skill. It's more of a skill than I think people realize sometimes. And I think I would want to have it be more conversational. I think I had a lot of, due to the nature of the subject matter, I had a certain amount of hesitance about taking up too much space in the interview, and so I think that was something too that I needed to get over myself about. I think that having a more organic conversational flow would really trickle down and make everything simpler. It would make the editing go more quickly, and I would be able to actually stick to a schedule and not go overwhelmed about it. And it would be very tempting to hire someone to handle the editing for me if I ever got to a point where I felt like that was in the realm of possibility. But yeah, as a passion project, it's you often just go the route.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as a passion project, it's not something that you can. It's a lot of money to spend on something that's a passion project. But do you feel that you'd still be able to get across what you wanted to achieve with your podcast if you had the conversational side of things?
Yeah, I think so. Because I was focusing on a group of people of which I am a member. So I think that a lot of the themes would still come through, and I would just need to get more comfortable with interviewing and having that conversation so that I don't feel like I need to spend hours and days editing it down.
Yeah. It is hard with interviewing, and you're right. It is a skill, and I got inside. I wasn't having the same kind of conversations that you were having in your podcast, but I still felt a bit awkward, and I did look at it like more of an interview. My first podcast was interviewing different virtual assistants and learning about their journey and how they got from where they were to where they were now, and what's evolved in their business and things. And I did keep looking at it more. It's more of it ended up being it's more of a conversationalist podcast, but I was looking at it like an interview, and that really kind of made me really nervous about doing the interviews. And I still do sometimes get inside my own head, and sometimes I'm so focused on the questions that I want to ask, I'm not really listening to what somebody's saying to be able to ask those questions that might just come up naturally in the conversation. And that is this Janet Murray that I mentioned earlier, she talked about, she used to be a journalist as well, so she's got kind of a but she was more of a print journalist than an interview journalist, and she was talking about getting some training, like interview training, and I'd never thought of that for a podcast, but actually depending on the subject, that the people that you're interviewing, having some kind of training and really being able to listen to what they're saying and then think of other questions to ask rather than the ones you'd already previously thought is a skill, and would be something that could be a really good investment as well, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I definitely had a similar issue to you, was just with the whole thing of like, oh, I've got to make sure I ask these questions, and like getting to the point, like, especially because I'm like ADHD and I will just like go off on a tangent if I let myself. So I think getting like overly focused on like, these are the questions I have to ask, like, it was hard to also like hear what they were saying and actually have the conversation. So that's a very real issue too.
Yeah, I totally get that. Would you feel more comfortable now doing interviews or conversationalists now, or what kind of things do you think you could do to help you feel more comfortable? Or would you be more comfortable now, having had that experience before and knowing kind of how you felt then? Like, what things would you maybe do differently in the future if you were to do a podcast?
Kara, I actually like the idea of interview training. now that you've brought it up, I think that would have been a huge help, and it still would be. Because I'm one of those people who is a lot more comfortable in writing than I am in like verbalizing. So the getting into the overthinking space when I'm like having a conversation is just something I do when I'm having normal conversations. So yeah, having more of a framework around just like how to approach interviews would be massively helpful. And that's definitely something I would want to look at doing.
Yeah, it's something that I thought about as well, and thought it would just be a really valuable skill to work on, and also could help with, like, not that I do a lot of presenting or speaking, but there's the potential for doing that as well. Or I don't know, if you end up getting on a panel somewhere at a conference or something like that, those kind of skills would come in handy there as well.
Yeah, I think I would feel more comfortable just having done it once and experienced all of these various ups and downs. Like, that's the cool part of mistakes, is that you can learn from them and do things differently the next time. So I feel like if I were to try it again, it would go a lot more smoothly.
Yeah, well, you're not starting from square one like previously. You didn't, because you don't know what you don't know, really, do you? So yeah, you've made the mistakes, and but I think it is important to make those mistakes, because you'll never learn or get that experience if you don't just start. You could pontificate forever about, well, like we were saying about perfectionism, about not starting the podcast or not letting it out there, because it's not. I had this as well with both mine. I was like, oh, who's gonna listen? And I don't know whether like what I sound like is all right, or if I edit it okay. But until you kind of do it, you're not gonna know. And we all learn by doing. We all didn't like walk as a toddler, like straight away, didn't not stumble over or anything like that, as you keep trying again to get it done. So at least you'll know you've got that experience under your belt, and that if you were to go forward, you can draw on that. Was it so there's no mistakes, you're just failing forward or something like that? Like,
Yeah.
not failing forward, but, you know, that kind of a sentiment.
I feel like the things that have come to my mind and just like thinking back on this are like, or one, that done is better than perfect. And
Yep.
And I think the other thing is that like a lot of people like to say comparison is the thief of joy. And I feel like it's also like comparison is the road to abandoned projects. You're just thinking too much about what other people are doing, and it sort of sucks the joy out of it for you. So yeah,
definitely.
better to just do it and see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. That comparison game is I often find myself sucked down that comparison game. And even earlier this year, I was trying to kind of like think about my business more strategically, and like going, oh, but comparing myself constantly to other things or outside influences or someone that's got like, you know, 10 more years experience than me, is like you're giving yourself that hard time thinking that you should know all that stuff and that you should get it perfect the first time round because you know about their mistakes, and obviously they would never have got there had they not made similar things. But yeah, you can get a bit, well, I can get a bit paralysed by that. And then trying to think of, I did some CBT last year, and I had some kind of like different exercises to do. A lot of my problems, it was overthinking, like stress caused by overthinking. So some of the tools that she gave me, I use in my business as well to help me when I am overthinking. I've got like a worry tree, and like thinking about like, can I do anything about it? Like, no. So, okay, park it's all this. And they've really helped me when I do have those kind of like, you know, day-to-day things in my business where I end up feeling like, oh, I can't do this or I can't do that. So those kind of exercises have really helped try and get over that, or stop the overthinking, because your brain just goes like a million miles an hour, doesn't it? And then
yeah, it does. Yeah, and something that has like been really illuminating from time to time is like, if you're listening to someone's podcast or you're like looking at their art or whatever, and you're thinking, oh my God, they're so amazing, like go like way back to like episode 1 or version 1 or or like the very first comic strip they drew or whatever, and it just like, it looks totally different, it sounds totally different. Like, you can sort of, if you go from like the beginning to now, you can like see the difference, and that comes through and then builds up as they get all of that experience. So, you know, they were starting from a much different place.
Everything can evolve along with you. I've been saying this as well, that I mean, my podcast has evolved over time, and like I said before, about you don't know what you don't know. And I think that it's a great thing for your podcast to evolve with you as your experience and your knowledge grows. Your podcast is, and I'm sure if I listen back to that first interview I did for my first podcast, oh my gosh, I was so nervous. I remember thinking afterwards, I'm so sorry because this is so rubbish. Because I felt like it was really rubbish. I felt like I really got into my, like, had my questions and all of this kind of stuff get into my head. And I thought, you know, but then again, if I hadn't started doing it, you know, you won't be where you are now. So the moral of the story is don't give up.
Yeah.
And try and work it.
Start.
Yeah, just do it. Have you got anything else or any other advice maybe that you'd like to give to somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast, or for their business, or as a passion project?
More than anything, I would just say, like, do your own thing, whatever it is. Because, yeah, nobody's going to have your ideas. Nobody's going to approach it exactly the way you do. So just roll with that and figure itself out.
Yeah, I think when I was starting my podcast, I knew there was another lady who was doing something similar to, and she'd started hers before me, and we'd met, and I knew her, and I was worried that she was going to think that I was copying her podcast, and I really got into my own. But I remember somebody talking about obviously there's a need for it if there's more than one podcast about something, because obviously there's more than one person in the world thinking or talking about that particular subject. But you're going to do it the way that you're going to do it. Like you just said, it's not going to be the same as her podcast because I'm completely different to her and I'll do it in a different way. Again, I suppose it's going back to that comparison game to not let it get in your head and say do it with as much of you in there as possible.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Sarah, and sharing your experience with podcasting. I would love to listen to the podcast. If you can find it out or if you have a link or anything, I can pop a link in the show notes. It'd be really exciting to have a listen to it and see. How many episodes did you do out of interest? How many did you do?
I did 4.
Do you know, that's not a lot more than far. That's still a lot more. I'm looking at some stats today, actually, and that's still a lot more than a lot of podcasts that only have 1 episode. But you started and you did it, so you still achieved 4 episodes. So I think that's really great. Anyway, we did it in 4 episodes.
Appreciate that.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on, Sarah. Catch up with you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to connect with me or get in touch, then head on over to my website. If you liked the episode, then I'd love it if you could leave me a review in your chosen podcast app. Your feedback is much appreciated. See you next time.